Hi, Cass. Welcome to Awaken and Align.
It is such a joy to be here with you, Laura.
It's such a joy. I miss you so much. Not even that we would speak every day, but just seeing your posts and what you share and what you do for our community. Um, I've been keeping up with your journey, and I guess I miss you because you don't live in New York anymore, but
I do get to visit now and be a total visitor with the rose tinted glasses, and I'm looking forward to that. So you'll hear from me when I do.
okay, good. So I met Cassandra 2 years ago. She was on the Work podcast, and I'll link her episode down below. And you really did help me uncover a lot of my racial awakening at that time, things that I hadn't internalized, things that I hadn't understood. And a lot of the things that you mentioned, which we're going to lead into that conversation, and why I wanted you to be here is to talk about collective rest and why that's so important in our healing journey. But this is your first time on this podcast, so do you mind giving a little background, a little origin story about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I am so honored to be here. I know you have a well-reputed list of guests, and so it feels like a blessing to be a small part of the lineage that you're collecting here in Awaken on the Line. But to all the listeners, hello, my name is Cassandra Lam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Vietnamese-American trauma-informed somatic healing facilitator. And I very specifically use that term facilitator rather than healer or practitioner, because I feel like that's really the art and science and magic of what I do. Facilitating experiences where people are able to connect more deeply with themselves and with each other. And I think what's really unique about my work is I pretty much mostly do group work, from small groups all the way down to like working with organizations. And that's kind of my sweet spot and my little area of impact. Um, let's see, a couple things about me. My parents are Vietnamese boat refugees, and so I'm the first generation to go to college, graduate, have the potential to make more money than my parents have. Um, and obviously, with that comes a lot of unique challenges and burdens. I also, very newly in my life, as of last year, was diagnosed with complex PTSD, which is something that I want to share because it really, I think, offers insight into my journey that led me to healership and then this type of work. I identify also as neurodivergent. So for folks who don't know, that's basically an umbrella term for a myriad of experiences, everything from autism to bipolar, complex PTSD, but essentially folks who have bodies and minds that diverge from the norm. But even as I say that word, I really bristle against it because the truth is all of nature is divergence and diversity. And I think very much the same for transness, for example. Um, and so even I use that term because I think it's helpful for now for people to understand what I mean, but I also feel very limited by it because I actually think the problem is that the norm that has been set out was dictated by white supremacy, and it's only a very few, very narrow band of bodies and minds fit that. So that's my little tidbit on that. Let's see, I am originally born and raised in Covina, California. So I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, really close to the large Mexican community and culture in LA, but also having connection to my own roots, namely Little Saigon, where my family and I would go every weekend. And I lived in New York for 8 years, which is where Laura and I met until I recently moved out last fall. And I'm currently based on Asheville, North Carolina, which is the unceded lands of the Cherokee.
Beautiful. That's why it's like a spiritual, energetic portal.
It's apparently the fourth spiritual vortex in North America, after Hawaii, Mount Shasta, and Sedona. So I will say that was probably a small part of it for me moving here. And I guess one quick thing professionally, since you did mention collective rest, I'm a somatic healing facilitator who specifically focuses on helping tired and trauma impacted people, communities, and organizations to find their way to rest And my whole premise is it's not that we as individuals are bad at it. There's a lot of internalized shame and guilt. It's actually that it was likely like that we and our families were not resourced enough, did not have the conditions, infrastructure wise, financially, for example, to actually feel safe enough to take rest. Rest, like many things in this country, has been privileged to the wealthy, people who have the privilege of having, disposable income and free time, right? And so as someone who grew up with a mother who is a nail tech, who has worked under the table her whole life without labor protections, and a father who was basically the breadwinner in our family, just it really, really matters to me to bring rest practices and to help bodies who have the least amount of resourcing in our society to find their way to rest. And so I really focus on that feeling safe enough piece. And that's where I find that doing it in community, hence the name Collective Rest, is so potent and powerful.
That is so beautiful. And I love that you added collective rest because I I think most healers, hopefully, come to a point in our journey where we realize no matter how much therapy we get, no matter how much self care or astrology or tarot readings we get, we're never going to feel well in a system that is sick, in an environment that's sick. That's almost like as a sober person, you go to back to the environment that made you drunk in the first place or have that
Mm-hmm.
addiction and allowed you to have those patterns. So I think my question leading into what I'm saying is, can we even have collective rest if we are not also dismantling the system that we live in?
So that's the beauty of the work that I do. And I'm like laughing because I realized looking back on my journey, both personally and professionally, I've always kind of been like a rabble rouser in that I am really interested in Trojan horsing the system and Robin Hooding the system, which to me means moving resources from those who have it to those who don't. And I really apply that philosophy in my work. And I think that's probably a large function or feature as to why I chose entrepreneurship, the ability to build a business that's wrapped around my values and to opt into partnerships with people who really are aligned with me, who respect me and value my work, which enables to me to be bold. And so I take very seriously the responsibility and the privilege I have to tell folks, whether it's my partners or like if it's a space I'm holding for the community, here are the rules of engagement here. And they're quite different from what you will experience out in the outside world, intentionally so. So at the core of the work of Collective Rest, or I guess I'll say it this way, kind of a tongue-in-cheek way that I like to describe what I do is basically the people who are intellectually on board with the Nat Ministries message. And for any listeners who aren't aware, I highly encourage you to follow at the Nat Ministry on Instagram. Trisha Hersey's work is really, I am a small branch off of the tree that she's really an elder to me in this work. Would be a dream to meet her in person at some point. But and she has a book that came out last year called Rest is Resistance, a manifesto. And so I really see myself almost like as a little branch off of her. And so what I try to do is I work with people who are intellectually on board, who love the message, who feel something in their spirit or their heart pull them forward and compel them to sit with what she's offering us. And I work with people who are like, okay, I'm on board, but I don't know how the hell to actually materialize what I believe in my embodiment. And so people who are on board with the message, but whose nervous systems are not in a place where they actually feel safe enough to take it. And I suppose this really comes from my own journey because I started following the Nat Ministry probably like 2019, something like that. And I remember when I first started seeing her posts, and she really she studied theology, so she has a really unique way of spreading the message. It's like a sermon,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you'll notice she says the same thing over and over because we do need to hear it a bazillion times. And I remember like I followed it for years. I like religiously like all her posts. I listened to any podcast she's on. I read her stuff, but it wasn't translating.
Mhm.
And I think the thing that I recognized in myself that I also saw was a challenge for a lot of my friends and my community members who also agree with the message but can't seem to make the change. I ultimately realized through my own rest journey, which I am like 3 to 4 years into, and there's still so much to go. It was really critical for me to figure out what exactly does my nervous system believe is safe,
Mhm.
and is that actually true? And what I realized was for many reasons, more than just capitalism and ableism, I realized in my own journey, especially in the healing I've done since viewing myself through the lens of complex PTSD, I got to see that my core survival strategy since I was a child growing up in a very emotionally volatile, unsafe home was that I believed, and I remember vividly being a child in elementary school and coming to this conclusion, Laura, that people and my parents may disappoint me, may let me down, may hurt me, whether they mean to or not. But the one thing that will never hurt me is what I can do, my work. Like there's a linearity that felt safe and comforting that and reciprocity, I guess, is what I'm saying. That felt safe and comforting in my relationship to my ability to work hard and achieve something.
Mhm.
That was like, okay, if I put one in, I'm going to get one or maybe more back. And that wasn't the same with my family or my parents specifically. So as you can imagine, as I got older, growing up under systemic oppression, it became more complicated by capitalism, ableism, sexism, racism, all the different ways women of color um, and anybody with a marginalized identity is made to posture themselves in order to survive. So it's a very personal journey for me, and I find that the personal and the professional and the political for me and the spiritual, I guess, all intersect here. And so to answer your question in that like sort of windy way,
Mhm.
at the heart of this work is awakening to the systems of oppression. But I really believe that we're at a point in, I think, human civilization, at least the era that you and I are alive in, where brute force and willpower and effort and pushing is not going to be the way that we change the direction that the ship is going. I really believe that what we're severely lacking is actually taking that step back, taking stock of how we feel, what hurts, what heartbreaks have we not grieved collectively, and allowing ourselves to be changed through the process of feeling and allowing the feeling to actually guide us to something different. So I found in my personal life that it has worked and actually resourced me enough to continue to show up in these really painful times. Um, and it's very different. It's like a feminine yin way
Mhm.
of creating impact and change, right? And it seems so small, but when you lie down, and Trisha says this too, and you do it over time consistently with a curiosity, you'll realize what actually matters to you, the prices that likely invisible and unconscious prices you've paid, not honoring your soul, spirit, body, and heart. And I think that's like coming back to that is what can ignite our sacred rage, our soul purpose, and our desire to collaborate with each other and actually meaningfully, in small ways, create the world that we all want.
Mm. Oh my gosh. That was a whole sermon too. Wow. I watched a video recently and I'm so sorry. I don't remember the person that spoke it out loud. She was a black woman and it was a clip from an old video. She said, "Fear makes you want to take care of yourself, but love makes you want to take care of yourself and others."
Whoa.
And I literally was like, there's so much synchronicity, and you messaged me this morning how we're in the Clips portal, and I watched Beef this weekend. Did you happen to watch that?
I already finished it with my
Yeah.
partner. It was
They did.
Amazing. I think I'm gonna watch it a second time just
Me
to
too.
glean different things.
I laughed, cried through the whole thing because
Uh-huh.
as Asian Americans who grew up as millennials specifically, it's such a specific group of people. I felt it, I felt their emotions in my body. Like I can
Hmm.
feel the rage, I can feel the frustration, and ultimately the movie is all about intergenerational trauma and how you channel rage.
Yeah.
And there's so many spiritual symbolism in that movie. But what you were saying about just allowing yourself to go slow to actually process grief and process rage. And it wasn't until, spoiler alert, the like last episode when both of the characters are just laying there, kind of like sick and like couldn't move and they
Yeah.
were dying, that they were able to process all of that.
And their ego got out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was like they were both controlled by this need to survive through like capitalism, like you were saying, and how that affects your body and how that affects your just like temperament. And
Yeah.
I think like it's such a special group of us where it wasn't that long ago that our parents came to this country as refugees, as leaving their country to pursue the American dream, quote unquote.
Hmm.
And then us as like first generation, we've had to kind of walk between worlds, between like being American, but then having this filial duty to our Asian
Hmm.
culture. And it's such a special group of people, if you think about it.
Oh, that show gave me so many feelings. Episode 8, I was like, is Amy Lau's character
You?
off of my literal life? Like,
I actually thought about you.
oh, yeah, no,
Not saying that you were
seriously.
not saying that you're psycho
Yeah.
like Amy Lau,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think each of us sees ourselves in both Amy and Danny.
It's so human. And I one thing I wanted to mention was um it reminded me of the Korean concept of Han, right?
Yes,
Like
yes.
that like inconsolable
Mhm,
pain that becomes rage and self-destruction.
mhm,
And I think that all of us probably have that because I think it's part of the human condition, but it's very unique in Asian culture because we have this cultural value around not looking messy, not bringing shame.
mhm.
So it's like, I think containment.
Yes.
And I think something I'm very interested in as an Asian American is how do we break the containment? Because I want our grief and our pain to spill over and to entangle us into radical relationship. I look at how lonely and isolated my parents are, which is very potentially also unique to like their own trauma and struggles. But also, I think for many people of diaspora in America, at least, loneliness and isolation and feeling the pressure to assimilate is your American experience, quite frankly. That is the actual genuine American dream.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I like that your what you just said ignited in me is just some like a quiet rage that I think has been it's like a little tiny candle flame inside of me.
Mhm.
But I think I bristle at the American dream, even like with the air quotes and all, like you did, because I'm like, oh my God, oh my goodness, there's a parallel universe, another multiverse where my parents could have been so happy in their home country if it weren't for US imperialism and US empire having a very serious political agenda
Mhm.
in the APAC area, right? I know Korea was affected too. Like so many Asian countries are mired in the US empire and the manipulative tactics. And so many of the reasons why Asian families even sought a quote unquote better life here was in part because of the ways the US meddled in other governments,
Mhm.
caused wars, like
Mhm.
instigated strife, right? And so I often wonder how different my parents' life could have been if they didn't have to steal away in the middle of the night on a rickety ass ship, not knowing if they would survive, running into pirates,
Mhm.
living in a refugee camp for 2 years, and then coming here as high school children. Like, what a freaking traumatic
Yeah.
life experience to happen when you're not even fully developed in brain and body yet.
Mhm.
And then to come here and not have any community, any public health services to help with refugee reintegration, it's a shame, I really think. And it brings a silent rage in me because I do recognize being an American is a privilege, but I also want, I think, to poke at and critique this sense of like gratitude that people say I mean, especially I think our parents' generation, right? Oh, we should be grateful we're here. And I'm
Yes.
like, I understand where they're coming from and it's so unique to their context. But I feel like I can be grateful to be an American. And I think there's a James Baldwin quote, right? Like, if you love America, then you have reserved the right to critique her,
Exactly.
so that she lives up to her ideals. And quite frankly, in our livelihood, like, but in our lifetime and right now, as I think about all the anti-trans legislation and the awful amount of gun violence just this year alone, like, things are not working here. And I think just being honest about that is has been so important for my journey of like even feeling, I think, in alignment with my API identity and what it means for me to be American.
Yeah, when you were saying that like little flame, I think it's always simmering in the background.
Yeah.
Each of us channeled it in a different way, and I always people always ask me in a very funny way, like, oh, why are Koreans always so angry? Why are they obsessed with
Mm.
money? And why are they always drunk? And I'm like, well, it's years of oppression, and that's how it comes out. So,
Addictions, yeah.
addictions, how have you been able to channel the rage and the trauma that lives in your body and kind of convert that into rest? Because that is so opposite.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So, I think so. I come to rest in a body and mind that, if I'm being honest, has not known rest for most of my life. Like, I have been working so hard since I was like a child in school, and I started working at age 16, and I've basically worked since then. I worked my whole way through college because there was no one to pay for school. Um and a lot of that was also, I think, me before my racial awakening, me living out model minority myth, me feeling so much like a void of a person. Like, I felt like being Asian growing up was like the absence of personhood. Like, you were not granted or conferred personhood just by virtue of existing. Asian folks have always had to prove it, like our citizenship, our worthiness, like, are we, and yet we still are like subjected to the perpetual foreigner thing, right?
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of wounding there. And I share this as context because I think that when I tell people that I guide our people's bodies to rest, that they assume that I'm like, you know, got this like perfect nervous system that's always regulated, and it cannot be further from the case, especially once I realized that the like that when I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, so many dots finally connected. And I think one of the number one thing that's very unique about complex PTSD is that we get emotional flashbacks, and they're quite different than like a PTSD flashback, which is usually very visual, like you're dropped into a memory. Like, for people like me, it's emotional. So you can't actually locate a time or a place, which makes it feel like
Yeah.
it's everything.
Mhm.
And so what that means is that, for like, and I've probably struggled with this for years, but it was always masked by working a lot, which was, and I've had a spiritual practice, which started with yoga for 11 years. And I'm so grateful to yoga. It's probably why I think I'm still alive today, given the amount of trauma and pain that I was going through. But I also was using yoga to sort of mask how how basically dysregulated my nervous system was all the time. Like, I am calm in crisis. Put
Mhm.
me in crisis
Mhm.
and I can lead. I'm calm. I know what to do. I'm clear. Like, my vision is so clear.
Mhm.
Put me in safety and I feel so unsafe. And
Mhm.
so the work for me is to like slowly balance those two. But how this connects to rest is that I want people to know I don't come to rest because it's easy. I come to it because it's saving my life.
Mhm.
I've had some health scares. I collapsed and I went to the ER with a mild concussion last year. So there's been real things where my body was showing me like, we can't handle this anymore. Like we need to seriously like take this rest thing really seriously for ourselves and hopefully like share it with other people who are also navigating similar. Um, and so part of coming into rest, and this is something I teach people a lot, is that sometimes the reason why rest actually feels really restless and terrifying and that flood of anxiety and stress, am I doing it right? Which is very similar to how many of us start meditation practices, right? It's very similar. And you can feel powerless. You're like, how am I ever going to do this if nothing ever stops or slows down? And so something that I've really had to work on, and what I teach other folks is that if that's the space you're in when you're trying to rest, you probably have some fight or flight activation energy that's still lodged in your system and it needs an avenue to come out. And so simple things like doing a progressive muscle relaxation or maybe getting a little bit of movement in, whether that's dance or running or um, doing a spin class, like whatever it is, like get that healthy aggression out, or rather get the aggression out in a healthy way. Otherwise, it's going to, as beef showed us, right, self-sabotage and wreak havoc in your relationships. And so I am very committed to honoring my grief and my rage, and they come up often. Like I have allowed myself to break shit before. I once had a painting that I really didn't like. It was a gift from an ex years ago, and there's one day, this was back in Brooklyn, I just had a bunch of rage come up, which will happen when you're on the healing journey too, as you recognize the injustices that you weren't
Yeah.
resourced before enough to like actually hold the weight of, right?
Mhm.
And so I remember like my partner went to like an acupuncture appointment, and I was like, okay, I have the apartment to myself. And I just took that, it was like a canvas stretched on like wood, and I just smashed it on the floor and just let myself like throw a tantrum. And it was so satisfying.
Yeah.
And I know that there are places like this. In New York City specifically, there's a place you can go where you just pay and it's like a rage room and you just break shit. I also am a big fan of screaming in the car when I'm having like a day where I'm just like on edge. And it doesn't even have to be anything happen. Like I just am regularly angry at our shared reality right
Yes.
now, for example. So I will just do this thing where at every red light, I'm just going to scream. And I don't have like that much vocal capacity. So I'm usually hoarse within like 5 minutes, but it doesn't matter. And so stuff like that, like not tamping it down, because I always find like on the other side of it, like I usually cry at some point anyway. That's when my body naturally feels ready to rest. And so they're so interconnected. And I think what a shame that like white supremacy has given us binary thinking, that we think that we can only do one or the other. Like I find that honoring the rage, the grief, and finding healthy ways for my aggression to come out actually allows my body to settle for rest, because otherwise um, that's some of the stuff that's like pinging around when I try to lie down and causes me to feel like this is not peaceful at all.
Yeah. So you're saying rest is just more than like taking a day off, and it's more than
Mhm.
just like napping. It's actually allowing your body to process and move through the latent emotions that maybe you had been repressing.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I think so often when people talk about rest and sleep, and I'll also differentiate them. So sleep, well, both sleep and rest are biological imperatives, just like eating, eliminating waste. Um, and so sleep is differentiated because that's usually your like multiple hours, right? Like ideally 7 to 8, they say. And the core function of sleep is like the deep level recovery and restoration. Like one way to think about it is if you ever drive on the highway or freeway at the middle of the night and they're doing construction, road work,
Mhm.
when everyone's sleeping, that's basically what your body's doing inside out when you're getting sleep. Rest, however, is different because we actually need multiple pockets of rest within one 24-hour day cycle.
Mhm.
And so in our bodies, we have three main biological rhythms. circadian, which most people know as the 24-hour cycle. Infradian is any cycle that's longer than 24 hours. So a menstrual cycle is an example of this. And then ultradian, which just means it happens more than once in a 24-hour cycle. And so there's this theory, I forget the guy's name, where basically he asserts this idea of a basic rest and activity cycle, BRAC. And what he says or posits for every like 90 minutes or so, about 70 of those minutes are where we have like clarity of mind, focus, we can give sustained attention to something. And then you'll notice like around after that 70 minutes, like you start to want to like open the fridge, procrastinate, you open your Instagram app, you're like, you don't really want to do any anymore. And so at that point, that's actually when the body is naturally trying to cycle you into the daydreamy state so that you zoom out, you take a step back. And so he posits that the final 20 minutes are when your body's calling for rest. And so if we were to, for example, listen to our body's signals, which it could be everything from like, okay, I'm feeling irritable, or I'm really distracted, or I find myself like wanting to do anything but this, that's usually a sign that your body's craving rest. And when we chronically deny ourselves that, and this is where the 40-hour work week is so inhumane and toxic, because human bodies can't actually be productive for 8 hours. Like maybe 4 or 5 of those hours, but the rest of the time you're like overriding your body and just trying to trudge, and that comes at great cost. And so when we're not resting at those natural intervals where the mind and body want to daydream and like let go and do anything else but work or focus, right? It starts to rack up a rest debt. Yes. And then so that's why many of us, by the time evening comes around, we cope with how wound up we are by going to happy hour, by mindlessly watching Netflix, by doom scrolling. And I'm not saying these things to shame it. There's nothing wrong with our coping mechanisms. We're living through a truly challenging and in some ways horrific time that's demanding people a lot of each of us, even though we're not given very much social support to survive it. So there's nothing like wrong with that. But what I always invite people to question in my practice and in my facilitation work is your current relationship to rest working for you? Are you satisfied with it? Because that's the thing that really matters. Like if you're not satisfied with it, great. And that's the beginning of an inquiry and a journey that will take you to places that you've never imagined. But I think that's the first step. Like even just questioning, like, am I okay with where I am, or do I want something different?
I go off on these rants on TikTok because TikTok is more favorable to conversations like these, which is probably why it's trying to be banned. But I said, like, every problem in our society can be traced back to white supremacy and then the evil trinity of patriarchy, capitalism, and palm color domination. And everything that's not conducive to nature was created by a white man. And the 40-hour work week was created by Henry Ford, who was a Virgo rising, by the way, of course. 40-hour work.
Also a billionaire, or like a millionaire at that point. We didn't have billionaires back then. That's a whole other thing.
But it just like they create these things to literally make people make them money. Like we are humans are billionaires, passive income. Like we are creating this wealth for them. So I think that's why I think we're living in a very interesting time where people are aware of these things now. Like people understand to a certain extent that we need rest, that we need to take the time, that we need to heal. But the structures in place are not conducive to that because it's so violent.
Violent, I think, is the perfect word for it. And I continue to use it because I think when we don't recognize, I think being alive right now, in America especially, is like daily living by death by 1,000 cuts. Totally. You know, but when they cut you a little bit, when you're asked or demanded to fragment parts of your soul in order to get a paycheck, in order to afford rent, in order to afford groceries, like they start to add up. And because our pace is so breathless, and we have a breathtaking, a breathless pace, And I want to uplift both capitalism and ableism together, because I find that, and I'm continuing to be a student of disability justice, but I think without analyzing capitalism
Mhm.
with ableism, we miss a core part of it. And one thing I'll share about ableism is that it's essentially it's an offshoot of capitalism. It became possible because of capitalism, where people's bodies and abilities were ranked in order of value based on whether or not you could produce. And so under ableism, disabled bodies are not worth as much because they can't endure the amount of traumatizing output that capitalism wants from each body.
Mhm.
And so, and um, and so as I say that, like, and the truth also is that like ableism is just, or rather, disability is a function of being a human being. Like you're gonna be disabled by getting old. That is what getting old is. You might lose your vision.
Mhm.
You might not be able to drive safely anymore. Or you could get in a car accident, or you could get sick. Like, chronic illness is rising in America, and it's also a contributor to disability, long COVID.
Mhm.
So disabilities, basically, ableism is like the demonization of a very natural human function. Like we're
Uh,
all going to experience it, and it gets vilified and shamed, um, so that we don't actually band together with folks who are disabled.
mhm.
And so I share that because I think it's the people whose bodies and minds cannot be compliant in any way in capitalism and ableism, who have so much to teach us and to show us the way towards liberation. And so really wanting to center queer, trans, disabled, disability justice activists who I continue to learn from. And I found so much healing in aligning with disability justice frameworks and values, because I realized it's helping me to come home to my humanity. Like
Mhm.
my self-love journey would be incomplete without contending with ableism. So just
Mhm.
wanted to offer that up to
Yeah,
listeners.
thank you. Thank you, because I follow a lot of disabled activists on TikTok, and they say that 1 in 3 people in the United States are disabled, which is like a lot of people.
And a lot of people are not telling us because they don't feel
Yeah.
safe.
Yes. Um, but because of their status as a disabled person, they can't get the same kind of benefits. Like there's this whole like other realm where they are being excluded from that we don't see because obviously
Yeah,
you wouldn't know if you weren't disabled. But so thank you for saying that.
right.
Which just further tells you how they look at us as humans, that we're just these like bodies to produce things.
Hmm.
Thanks.
It's really dark and dystopian.
Very
Like
dystopian.
we're basically, it's like not, and this is where Trisha Hersey talks about a lot about this in depth in her book, but capitalism cannot be divorced from slavery.
Mhm.
American capitalism was founded upon an economic system where Black bodies were used for free labor, and that's how the Henry Fords, the Rockefellers, the da 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 da, like all this old money, that's how America became wealthy. It was
Mhm.
off the backs of other people. And so this is our dark history that I think our country has yet to contend with. Um, and yet it's here, like, and I think the land remembers as well. And so, yeah, it's really, and I think like
Loud.
moving to the South has been such a humbling and eye-opening experience, because the land here, this is where slavery started, but it's also at the same time, this is where rebellion and revolution started at the same time, like those two in reaction to each other. So it feels, um, yeah, I'm just heartbroken that so many of us have only ever known this, but I really, really hunger for what comes afterwards.
But we're circling back to what you first said when we first started speaking, which is collective rest as a form of revolution and resistance, which is, I think they call that soft power. It's not with brute force, it's not with
Yeah.
violence. And um, something that I think about a lot with like Pluto and Aquarius, I know you're a little bit versed with astrology, is I always have a critical lens of people who talk about these things because 250 years ago when Pluto was in Aquarius at the founding of the United States, like you were saying, the revolutionaries, the
Mm.
insurrectionists were also slave owners. So revolution and freedom and liberation was different for them than it was for the indigenous and black enslaved people here. So
Hmm.
now when we're thinking about like revolution and resistance now, as we have our Pluto in Aquarius again, what does that look like? Because there's a population of people who revolution and resistance did not work out for them 250 for 250 years. So it's interesting to see your take on it as more of a collective rest and more of like reclaiming our space here versus like an insurrection. Do you want to say
Yeah,
that?
that's so potent. Because I remember reading that somewhere that last time it was both the American and French revolutions that were happening at the same time, and those were bourgeois class like revolutions too. And not really one where like the people were leading. But very interesting, like you said, to know that's our historical context. Last time Pluto was in Aquarius, and to be like, well, what's different now?
Mhm.
Um, I'm just taking a moment to digest your question. I think the soft power piece is so important, and a big influence on my sort of orientation here. I want to uplift Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. He is a Nigerian PhD psychologist who ended up totally leaving psychology, very disenchanted with it because it's a Western model that still posits a separation of mind and body. And he grew up in Nigeria with the Yoruba people and Yoruba shamans, and just has a very different context, very connected to his people and who he comes from. And a lot of his work is very transgressive, and I love it. It's edgy, but and he has a lot of podcasts. If listeners want to give it a try, For the Wild podcast has, I believe, two different episode interviews with him. And that was actually my initial foray into his work. But I love his work because he talks a lot about the politics of cure, which is like
Mhm.
in the trauma and therapy world here in the West, so much of psychology and psychiatry is about curing
Mhm.
Black, Brown, Native, Asian bodies. Um, and he talks a lot about how psychiatry is an arm of the carceral state, and how he has really incredible like stretchy thoughts about trauma. And he talks about how maybe trauma isn't a bad thing, but it's how our bodies are being morphed and changed to prepare us
Mhm.
for the challenge of our times, and there's a wisdom and an innate intelligence in it. But anyways, I think the thing I wanted to bring in is that he talks a lot about trickster energy is needed right now. We really need to embody the archetype of the trickster, and to go into the places that white supremacy has deemed worthless, and to reject it, to go into those shadowy depths, the crevices, the cobwebby corners of everything, and to look at like how we are doing our activism work, right? Because if our activism work is basically just a reaction to the very same systems we're trying to change, we are actually still mired in that system,
Mhm.
because that it's the same mode of thinking. And this is where it kind of gets a little mindfucky, but stay with me for a second. I guess this kind of connects to like, well, when slavery was formed, immediately rebellion and revolution was formed, right? So everything in an entangled universe affects everything else. And so cause effect, something happens, there's a reaction. And so if we are reacting to systemic oppression, using systemic oppression's rules of engagement, continuing to like apply cancel culture even within our leftist spaces, for example, it's one example, we are still edifying that system of oppression because we haven't broken out of it. We're
Right.
just claiming to be better than it
Yeah.
using the same tactics.
Mhm.
And so we don't even, as a people, as a collective, we haven't even conceived of
Mhm.
a mode of thinking and beyond what we know, because it has been so traumatizing and overwhelming to just survive. And so this is where dream work,
Mhm.
imagination work,
Mhm.
reading, futurist writing, like Afrofuturism, for example, or even sci-fi. Sci-fi is a really great genre for imagining other ways that we could relate to each other.
Mhm.
Octavia Butler, for example, her work.
Mhm.
So that's sort of where I feel rest can be is a really overlooked piece of activism. We for so long have adopted the idea that global systemic change means action. But
Mm-hmm.
action
Mm-hmm.
looks many different ways.
Yes.
Choosing to lie down and to connect with your inner world and to contend with your traumas and triggers and the biases you have and the ways in which we say we love, we say these are values, but we still have places where we're conditional with our love for our neighbor and each other and the people we don't like. Contending with that through rest and reflection and pause is a really necessary piece of the activism work. And I think it's just not been done because, at least in my experience, capitalism has only ever valued tangible, visible outcomes. Like if there's no outcome right now, then it's not worth it. But rest is a long-term game.
Yeah.
And healing, spiritual development. And I know you know all this very well too, and that this is what you like share with your clients and community. But this is, I think that's the point in time we need to move to. Like so much of white supremacy has only ever been focused on mine in the short term, which is why climate crisis is where it's at, right? So we actually need to move to like long term, everybody needs to be taken care of because we all affect each other.
Yes. I love that. What a beautiful time to end that beautiful. No, I really believe that. I believe the more we rest, the more we can imagine and co-create something differently and not just like repeat cycles. Because
Not just respond to trauma.
I literally
Yeah.
told my spirit guides, like, I don't want to repeat any of this karmic shit anymore. Like, I'm done.
Mhm.
Let me do what I need to do. And
How do I get free? Help
what
me
you just
along.
what you just said reminded me of what Danny Cho says in Beef. He's like, Western therapy doesn't work on Eastern minds. I was
You know
like,
what?
yeah,
I think Eastern minds are also non-dualistic, which I mean, this is a little general, but I think we have a lot of non-dual spiritual traditions. I think
totally.
about Zen Buddhism. I think about Advaita Vedanta, for example, right? I'm sure there's more. I'm not naming as well in Asia, but we've always been able to hold paradox in
Yes.
Eastern thought, and that's what makes it different from Western. Western thought can't hold paradox.
Right. And they even talk about the yin and the yang in that show. Like there was so many spiritual symbolism in that show.
Yeah.
I have to go rewatch it. But thank you so much, Cassandra Lam, for being here and sharing your wisdom. If anybody wants to work with you, I will put all of your information in the show notes. But you do take clients, yes?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. I have community rest sessions that are hopefully going to come back in May, if not May, June. I've just had to take a break to deal with some back end stuff and my cat being sick. But I am looking forward to coming back to that. I also have a group program for Asian women and femmes who want to learn how to rest. The second cohort of that this year will probably launch in fall. And then I have other like goodies like a newsletter and a Patreon where people can do rest practices at home as well.
Beautiful. Thank you for doing everything that you do for us and talk to you soon.
Thank you, Laura, for your gifts, your magic, your shine. Thank you.
Thank you.